Going live with Chris Lehmann.
Hello, everyone. This is Chris Lehmann, editor of The New Republic. I'm very happy to be moderating a panel discussion tonight on the theme of our June cover issue, which is The Great Reboot, which is an effort which I should back up and sort of say we sort of in January and February of this year, we didn't really imagine we would be reckoning with the question of how the American economy can be reimagined and reconfigured in the wake of a deadly global pandemic that has compelled us to shut down a lot of the day-to-day operations of the economy. So it was a bit of a editing and assigning challenge, along with the sort of first order challenges of having to migrate my own job within the four walls of my home and conditions of social distancing. So one of, in fact, the first person who I thought of to write for this article very happily complied. And that's one of our guests tonight, Dean Baker, who is senior economist for the Center for Economic and Policy Research, author of the book, so many books. The most recent one is called Rigged, which one of the reasons I admire Dean is he's, as we'll learn as we go tonight, is a fierce critic of status quo intellectual property and patent regulations, and he has actually put his money literally where his mouth is and made Rigged available gratis in ebook form. Also joining us is New Republic staff writer Kate Aronoff, who is our climate reporter. Kate has, I believe, is working on a book manuscript now, and recently contributed to the anthology. I'm going to get this wrong, right? The Future is Ours. Is that right?
We Own the Future.
We Own the Future. I made it kind of more gentle. I want to thank you both for taking part in tonight's discussion. I also should do a little bit of preliminary business plugging in the spirit of economic revival. If you're engaged by the topics of tonight's discussion, you can also consult Dean's recent appearance on the New Republic's podcast, The Politics of Everything. It's a segment titled Reimagining the Post-COVID Economy. You'll also be able to follow this discussion sort of after we've recorded and posted it on our, or actually it's going live on our Facebook site now. And that's all I got. So I wanted to sort of start with a fairly obvious question that's pivots off today's news, which is the American stock market had a pretty robust day today. It's up 300 points based on news of enhanced quarterly earning projections, and this is all it's a sort of certainly in my memory one of the most dramatic kind of split screen effects we've seen of dramatizing the disjunction between the investment economy and the real economy. Circa 2008, the jobs economy collapsed, the financial sector collapsed first, which I guess explains why we saw these indicators sort of, going off the cliff in tandem. So I first wanted to ask you, Dean, what explains this dramatic disparity between the investment economy and basically locked down real economy, And relatedly, what are the sort of measures and incentives you recommend to sort of bring these key indicators back into better alignment?
Well, first off, we have to think of what the stock market, even in principle, is supposed to be. So in principle, I mean, this is the textbook, so this isn't some radical lefty thing. The textbook story, what the stock market's supposed to represent is that's the value of expected future profits of corporations. So they're not asking the question, you're thinking of buying Microsoft stock or Boeing stock, GE, whatever it might be. It's not, do I think the world's good? Do I think the economy's good? Do I think people are doing good? No, you're asking, what do I think Microsoft's profits are going to be over the next 5, 10 years, whatever time horizon I'm looking at. So that's the question investors in the stock market are answering when they're deciding whether to buy or sell stock. So we did see the market plummet. Of course, it fell by quite a bit. I forget, 25, 30%. We'd have to go back, or I'd have to go back and check the exact number, but it fell quite a bit. I knew a lot of people were scared to death of what's going to happen. And then it shoots up when we hear announcements of the bailout plan. And I think it's not hard to explain, because the bailout one, of course, it was good. I mean, we need a bailout, obviously, but it was very business friendly. So you have, okay, we're going to bail out Boeing. Do we put conditions on Boeing? Do we tell Boeing that, you're getting all this money from the government, you're going to pay your CEO $2 million a year rather than $20 million a year? No, we didn't do that. Did we say no dividends for shareholders, no buybacks? We didn't do that. And that was pretty much across the board. It was a very, very business-friendly bailout. And everything we've seen ever since has been very, very business-friendly. So one of the things that we see now, Trump said this, other Republicans, they don't want to extend unemployment insurance. They're saying that we want to force people to go back to work. So here you have factories that are unsafe. We want to force people to go back to work because you're going to lose your benefits if you don't. So everything that we've seen, certainly coming from the Republican side, and the Democrats haven't always been that much better, but certainly the Republican side, they've really been controlling the ball here. That's been very, very business friendly. So if I'm deciding, do I want to put money into these corporations? Well, they look pretty good, because the people who are controlling the money right now are saying, yeah, we're going to ensure corporate profits stay good, well through this.
Right.
So
and losses can be written off. It is, I mean, one of the things that I find striking in the piece you published for us is you sort of give a thumbnail account of the growth of the financial sector in relationship to the real economy, and how, it's sort of, I think, grown sixfold or so over the past 4 decades. And you point out that if you see that kind of growth that is decoupled from, actual economic activity, as is often the case with the financial sector, you would, and I think you give the example of the trucking industry, like if the, trucking industry had, metastasized out of all proportion to its actual contribution to the economy, we would recognize something was wrong.
yeah, so the point to keep in mind here about finance, it's an intermediate good. So this isn't trashing it or anything. We need a financial sector, just like we need a trucking sector, so no one would get rid of the trucking sector. You wouldn't do that. How we can get things from point A to point B. But if we see the trucking sector expand hugely relative to the size of the economy, and that's what we have seen with the financial sector, then we'd say, well, what are we getting for that? Are things getting from point A to point B more quickly? Do we see less waste in food? I mean, you could tell a story, but you'd want to see it. So I go, okay, well, we have the data. The financial sector, and here I'm just talking narrowly, stock and bond trading, investment banking, that's quintupled relative to the size of the economy since the 70s. So go, okay, so are we doing a better job? Do we think we're allocating capital better? So if someone wanted to argue that, fine. I mean, someone might argue that, but I think on the face of it, it's pretty hard to tell that story, particularly when we just had, I mean, I can't blame the financial sector for the pandemic, but certainly if you go back a decade, yeah, I could blame the financial sector for the, the housing bubble and crash. I could certainly blame the financial sector for playing a really big role in that. So trying to tell me, oh, they're doing a much better job for the economy, kind of hard to say that.
Right, and yeah, it is bracing, and I think, Kate, you can speak to this. Someone who sort of came of political age in the wake of the 2008 meltdown, and to see something like this, a dozen years later, and feeling, not only are there, the same basic structural decisions being made, but many of the same players are making these calls. And, you've written a lot for us about ways to, think of this moment, particularly with the collapse of the oil industry, as a time to, pivot into something like a Green New Deal and, envision a jobs economy that is actually, going to help rescue a lot of displaced workers in the oil and coal sectors, at the same time, producing a greener economy, fighting climate change, and, addressing inequality. Can you sort of give your vantage based on the reporting you've been doing on your beat?
Yeah, it's interesting just thinking about the kind of life cycle of the term, the Green New Deal, which first, that some of the first serious thinking about it came out of the financial crisis in 2008, mostly by researchers in the UK, people like Ann Pettifor, who, were asking some of the same basic questions that I think people are asking now, which is how do you design a recovery from a recession that puts us on a more sustainable footing, broadly speaking. So dealing with both inequality and sort of thinking about how to scale up things like clean energy, and to take on a lot of the crises which exist in the economy. And so that is not the way that the recovery in the UK went, certainly, or most of Europe. And so that conversation was sort of quiet. And then, fast forward to when the Green New Deal makes it back into the headlines in the fall of 2018 with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sitting in at Nancy Pelosi's office. And, is really sparks a conversation about what the response to the climate crisis should be, and sort of starts actually having a conversation about solutions to that, which are at the scale of the problem, which is, I won't sort of reiterate here, but is massive. But the sort of argument against that, which I think was a little hard to answer for a while, was, well, the economy's at full employment. If you're talking about at what is widely considered full employment. So if you're talking about, something like the New Deal happened because there was a really obvious crisis, right? There were millions of people out of work, people, risk starvation, land, conservation problems, sort of, a whole range of things that were obvious crises to a lot of people, in the way that for at least folks in much of America, the climate crisis is not. Yeah, it is, a pressing problem for many people around the world. For many in the US, it's not. And so now, that's we're in a very different political moment, right? Where we have, the highest levels of unemployment in the US, 14.7% in April, since the Great Depression. And so I think there's a real attempt to sort of restart the Green New Deal conversation, which kind of ran through the primaries. And then I think after, the Democratic primary, the winner of that became, sort of obvious, that conversation quieted down a little bit. And so now I think there is like a real interest in having something like a green stimulus.
Yeah, no, and we're actually in this moment where I've seen a number of pieces on the campaign and Biden's agenda. As I think we're at a moment where a lot of people are obviously projecting their own preferred agendas onto a candidate who is still a bit of a simultaneously a super known quantity and an unknown quantity being tested in this crisis. And there is a lot of talk. The New York Times had a piece over the weekend about how Biden's brain trust is actively looking for a suite of ambitious proposals on the scale of a New Deal. Similar piece was in New York Magazine. And I would like to claim that we were there first with Dean's piece. And Dean, I think very wisely did frame your recommendations as something that, pragmatic agenda items that can be achieved under a Biden presidency, under the prevailing sort of political climate that we're in right now. And one, one of the centerpieces of your argument, which I was not surprised of since I've followed your work for quite some time, you point out the extent to which the American regime of intellectual property and patent rights has grievously distorted economic reward, especially in the pharmaceutical industry, which is obviously a key player in confronting the COVID crisis. And I think we're seeing, I think this, I don't want to say it's an exciting moment for you because it's a grim moment, but you are seeing in a very, dramatic way the critique you've been sort of putting forward for many years now, getting a, life or death test in the the race to develop a vaccine for COVID. Can you sort of explain to our viewers the critical role that patent rights and intellectual property have played?
Yeah, one of the points that it's kind of funny because obviously I talk a lot to economists as being an economist, but one of the things that's striking is how little recognition economists have of the importance of patent and copyrights in the economy. And this is both in terms of just how large they are and also how they affect the distribution of income. So one of the standard stories when you point to the upward redistribution of income, the conventional view is, oh, well, that's because of technology. And the point I always make was, well, it wasn't technology that made Bill Gates one of the richest people in the world. It was the fact that we have copyright and patent laws, so we'd arrest anyone who made copies of Microsoft software without Bill Gates' permission. That's not technology. Those are the rules we have on patents and copyrights. I mean, that's not really an arguable point, right? I mean, it serves a purpose, no doubt about it. It gives people like Bill Gates incentive to develop new software. That's a good thing. But we could do that differently. We don't need patents and copyrights, or we could have them be shorter, we could have them be weaker. These are all our choice. And I focused on this in the case of prescription drugs because one, it obviously this is crucial for our life, for our health, and it's very clear today. But the other is it's an incredible amount of money. So we're going to spend $500 billion on prescription drugs this year. That's about 2.5% of GDP. It's an enormous amount of money. I like to use the food stamp budget because you get all these people really excited when you talk about food stamps. There's all these right wingers. All my money's going to food stamp. Okay, food stamp budget's $70 billion. So we're talking about 7 times the food stamp budget. And then the real key part of the story is we're spending $500 billion. Suppose we snap our fingers, get rid of all the patents and related protections, selling drugs in a free market. You like a free market, folks? Okay, we'll sell drugs on a free market. Costs us less than $100 billion. Drugs are cheap. Again, I say that sometimes, I say them in an audience just to get their attention. They think I'm a nut. And I go, they're cheap to manufacture and distribute. They end up being expensive because we have patent monopolies. So what I argue is that we should be looking to alternative mechanisms for financing research, and we have them. So it's not like I have to dig something up. We have the National Institutes of Health. We spend $40 billion a year financing biomedical research at the National Institutes of Health. Everyone agrees it's money very well spent. Now, most of that is more basic research. They do sometimes develop drugs. They've developed some very important drugs, Taxol, ACT, those were developed on the NIH's nickel. But most of it is more basic research. But suppose you spent more, you doubled it, tripled it, and paid for the research needed to develop drugs, take them through the testing process, the FDA approval process, and then they would be sold as generics. They'd be cheap. We'd save an enormous amount of money. And you take away the incentive drug companies have to lie about the safety and effectiveness of their drugs, which they do all the time. The opioid crisis, a lot of that story is that Purdue Pharma and the other drug companies were telling doctors, oh, these are great new generation of opioids. They're not addictive. They knew they were, but they said otherwise because they could get a lot of money by selling them. So with the pandemic, this comes up front and center with the vaccine where what you'd like to see is fully open research. We have a common problem. We have this horrible pandemic. We need to develop a vaccine against it as quickly as possible. Most people agree science advances most quickly when it's open. So if we have a team of researchers, whether it's here, whether it's in Germany, whether it's in China, wherever it is, if they find that they have a great breakthrough, why not share that so Others could do that. Others might be working on something similar. Oh, this works. Let's build on that. Alternatively, maybe something fails. It's a dead end. Well, we don't want other researchers pursuing a dead end if they could find out that a group of researchers in Germany determined it's going to go nowhere. So what we'd like to see is open research so we get a vaccine as quickly as possible. And then, of course, if it's open, we've paid for the research in advance, it will be cheap, because almost certainly it's going to be cheap to produce, cheap to distribute. We don't have to worry. I've been sort of amazed that people are going, oh, we're going to have to try to get them to give us a price that we could afford. Well, if there were no patent, we wouldn't have to be begging them. It would be cheap. So
Right.
we create this huge problem for ourselves. And, then we're scratching our heads. How are we going to deal with this? If we didn't finance the research this way, we won't have the problem.
Which is one of the, I think interesting, one of the reasons I reached out to you originally to write this piece is that this, among other things, is a moment where we can sort of, take a renewed look at the kind of political decisions that have gone into the creation of the modern American economy, and understand that, as is the case with both, the financialization of the productive economy and the enclosure of the pharmaceutical industry's intellectual property protocols. These are decisions that are political decisions at bottom. They're questions of how you write the rules in advance, and who is going to benefit from a certain set of protocols and rules. And I think, we part of, the split screen effect and the kind of way in which, we at the most extreme kind of envision, a bald trade-off between opening the economy and an acceptable volume of mass death. These are questions that are more than obviously more than narrowly policy-driven, wonky matters of the economy as we've come to understand it. And I'm wondering, I guess for both of you, and maybe we'll start with you, Kate. How do we go about, reviving what I think of as the kind of 19th century model of the political economy, something that is both things at once, which has always been the case, but at some point along the line, we separated these two disciplines in a way that they interact badly with one another. What are your thoughts based on the reporting and research you've done?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think some of those lines are starting to break down. So the sort of drive to see the economy as this, even the word the economy, which people like Tim Mitchell have written about, is treated as a sort of machine into which you can sort of poke it and move it in the right direction, but it's this amalgamated mass. But I think the bailouts sort of make clear, and even things like kind of moves at the Fed and monetary policy, these are deeply, deeply, deeply political decisions, as you were just saying. And so I think that's certainly been clear for folks who, have kind of paid close attention to this and, are in circles which kind of talk about political economy properly. But the idea now, I think to more people than ever, that the, quote unquote economy as we know it is the product of politics, is really more certain. I think then the question becomes, how do we shape it, right? If the economy is not this sort of removed mass that only, a set of sort of soothsayers can sort of understand and interpret, then it is the province of democratic politics. And so what is the demos in that case pushing for, right? And so I think that is kind of the contest we're in now, I mean, in so many words, right? So I think, I focus a lot on climate politics, and we've seen in the last year, everything from the Sunrise Movement here in the US to climate strikers in Europe to sort of persistent demands from folks in the global South to really kind of write something which hasn't been included in the definition of the economy into that as well, which is the climate and our ecology, sort of non-human natures, as we might call it. And I think that, you know, is in a maybe optimistic word, I would say, going to be a part of the story moving forward. I think that will look differently in different places. So probably, you know, will not be a sort of driving force behind how the Trump administration responds to this crisis. But, you know, we're seeing efforts in places like South Korea. They're pursuing something called a Green New Deal as their recovery measure. There's the Green Deal in Europe, which is, you know, very complicated and controversial in its own way. But I think that the thing which has been neglected for so long is being sort of, you know, in some ways the basis of all value, right? Is our what we get from the earth and how we, you know, change the earth. That is being sort of newly respected, thanks to a lot of activism, thanks to, you know, a lot of people really raising that point actively, and the, you know, uptick of actual climate emergencies, which we're already starting to see in this year with cyclones, you know, across the world, hurricanes sort of coming up. And so I think, you know, it's both political economy and an understanding that political economy exists as part of nature, right? And that involves, you know, thinking seriously about climate and not doing the thing that recoveries tend to do, which is just to blindly fuel sort of aggregate demand and try to get GDP up. And so people are really making claims about what direction that should be pushed in, which I think is good.
Let me make a couple points on that. One, you know, you asked the question about political economy. One of the, what I consider an enormous victory that I think hasn't gotten as much attention as it deserves, is that the Federal Reserve Board has hugely changed the way it thinks and talks about the economy. Here I'm speaking specifically to the chair, Jerome Powell, and part of this dates back to Janet Yellen, so I don't want to single him out to her exclusion. But they have quite explicitly said that monetary policy is about income distribution. That if you let the unemployment rate get down to 3.5%, as they did to their great credit before this pandemic hit, that means not only that we have a lower unemployment overall, but disproportionately, when the unemployment rate gets low, the people who are getting jobs who are those who are most disadvantaged, discriminated against in the labor market, African Americans, Hispanics, people with disabilities, people with criminal records, they were getting jobs and they were seeing pay increases. So we are seeing things go in the right direction, because the Fed allowed that to happen. And the conventional wisdom in the economics profession, if you go back 10 years ago, and this is by liberals too, so this isn't just a right-wing thing, was that, okay, so the economy's bigger or smaller, but the Fed's doesn't have a direct effect. This doesn't have a direct effect on income distribution. And now they recognize that effect is huge. And that was a big change, and it really changes how people think about, you know, the Fed, monetary policy, and macroeconomy. So that was a really, really huge change. The other thing, picking up on Kate's point, talking about the Green New Deal, one of the things we're going to have to contend with, needless to say, we're looking at huge deficits in 2020, probably 2021. There's going to be a lot of people who are going to say, oh, because we have these big deficits, we can't afford, you know, we'd really love to, you know, do something on climate change and clean energy.
We're already seeing.
And the reality is it's just the opposite. And the logic here is what you were referring to earlier, that if we have large scale unemployment, which I mean, I'd rather we didn't, but, you know, not much we can do about that. We're going to, you know, I can't tell a story where we're not looking at very high unemployment, even 2021. So I'm not even talking about the rest of this year. And that's exactly the context where it makes a huge amount of sense to say, okay, let's have a really ambitious program to pay people to install solar panels, to make our buildings more efficient. We should be subsidizing mass transit, of course, making it safe against the pandemic. But, you know, these are all things that require a lot of work. So we don't have to go, where are the resources? The resources are the people who are unemployed. But that requires a different thinking about deficits than has traditionally been the case here. And, you know, fortunately, there's been movement on that. The deficit, they'll be there. I mean, you know, as soon as we get a Democrat in the White House.
I live in DC. They're not going anywhere.
Yeah, so they'll be there, but I think we've made enormous headway in changing that debate.
Right, and so what beyond, you know, the sort of measures you just mentioned, you know, what would be your advice to Joe Biden right now in terms of, you know, what are the three main, you know, policy priorities that he should be putting forward to address, use this moment, to use, a time when deficits matter less and where government has to be the employer of last resort. You mentioned things like retrofitting buildings and getting, basic Green New Deal type measures. What are some of the other things that need to be front and center?
Well, certainly promoting mass transit. I mean, I'm sort of struck, and by this I mean buses, because I love, I lived in DC for many years. I love the metro, but those take time, and we could get more buses on the road tomorrow, and ideally clean buses, electric buses. We could do that. I mean, that's I don't mean literally tomorrow, but pretty quickly. So that's something we should have, and they should be free. I mean, the amount of money, the idea, we should make everyone pay their $1.50, $2. I mean, I used to take a bus off into work, and one of the things that was always striking me is people get on the bus, and some of them had cards, others were fumbling with their their wallet to get out the money. It's just like, why do we need this? We waste a lot of time, devote a lot of resources to playing with what in the scheme of things are relatively small money, and they're doing something we want them to do anyhow. So the whole idea of making people pay is you're trying to ration it. We really don't want to ration. Take the bus as much as you damn want. That would be great. So that's something I think would be really, really important. One of the other things, and I wrote this in a piece, is kind of a free lunch. In the UK, in London at least, they have congestion pricing. So they charge you a lot of money to drive into the city during the middle of the day. That, to my view, is a great thing. And it's one of these, it has a strange lineage, because as far as I know, the first advocate of that was Milton Friedman, of course, famous conservative economist. It was put in place in London under Livingstone. I'm forgetting his first name now, but he was a very left-wing Labour Party mayor. But it's something that just makes a hell of a lot of sense. And, so there's some other things like that, but that really has to be front and center. That it can't be like, oh, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. Oh, and by the way, I'll also try and do something on climate. I mean, it really has to be front and center, and it absolutely should be, because this is a very big chunk of our economy. So he really should, and he shouldn't be shy. This is creating jobs. So yes, we have to do something for the people who lose jobs, but I mean, better or worse, they already lost them. I mean, I don't want to make fun of it. I mean, it's horrible.
Right. No,
it's jobs, but they lost them. That wasn't Joe Biden who did it. That was the economy.
Mm-hmm. And it does occur to me, like, it's been sort of a running joke throughout the Trump years that infrastructure week never happened, right? And
there's still time. There's still a few months
left. We had 2 dams burst in Michigan, which are it's displaced tens of thousands of people. There is a lot of apart from creating a new greener infrastructure, the existing infrastructure needs a lot of attention as well. And as you say, there are lots of people unemployed. There are also people employed in sectors that under a Green New Deal are not going to be around. And Kate wanted to bring you in because you wrote just this week about in putting on your own campaign advisor's hat, saying the Democrats have a real opportunity right now, given the continued loss of jobs in the coal sector, which map on to key swing states. Here's a pretty a creative opportunity staring you in the face. So say more about what needs to happen there.
Yeah, sure. So I wrote about sort of the collapse of 2 big extractive sectors. So one being coal, which has been really on the decline for a long time. And the coronavirus, sort of not unsurprisingly, because energy demand is really low now, has been, hit very hard. The other, which looked shaky to people who were paying close attention, but I think was sort of widely assumed to be a more stable industry, is oil, which is starting to sort of creep back up, but was trading in West Texas Intermediate was trading at negative prices, which is just sort of historically unheard of thing. So regardless of where prices are right now, it's people being optimistic about $30 a barrel for Brent crude is not a great place for the oil industry to be in, and it's facing still what many have called its biggest crisis since there's been an oil industry. And what I wrote about this week is that is I would say, on the one hand, a moral obligation to protect the sort of many jobs bound up in that industry, which I'll talk about in a second, and also a huge political opportunity for the Democrats. So, just to hit that first point, I think we can think about, the jobs bound up in the fossil fuel industry as rightly, those folks who go down in the mines, people who are working on rigs, but there's much, much more bound up in it. So even, there's a sort of next level of that, which is oil field services companies, which have lost enormous amounts of jobs on track for 1 million, I think by the end of this year. And then there's state and local tax bases, which are hugely dependent on the sort of high incomes that these industries bring in. And if you're, in a place like West Texas or parts of Appalachia, that's a huge chunk of your income of a state budget or tax revenue is related in some way to fossil fuels, and that in turn funds things like hospitals, and in turn funds things like schools, and just the sort of public sphere in those places more generally, which are not being supported. And so there is a huge overlap between, as you said, and as I write in the article, between places which are experiencing what will, in all likelihood be something like a depression, even if it doesn't get that bad for the rest of the economy, because these extractive sectors are going through such trouble. And there's just such a clear opportunity in Texas and Pennsylvania and Virginia and North Carolina and all of these states to really make the case that Democrats are on the side of workers when the Trump administration is so clearly on the side of their bosses, of oil executives who, there was one oil company which applied for a $9.7 million tax break and immediately through bankruptcy court applied to funnel that amount to 4 executives in that company. So, the sort of, loyalties of the bosses of coal and oil companies are pretty clear. And so there's just a number of things that Democrats could do, and even if that's a sort of aspirational proposal to sort of make that political case that they're on the side. So, very easy things, some of which are sort of already in the discussion, things like support for state and local tax bases to help folks, just kind of stay above water, but also, comprehensive jobs programs to sort of get people who are in or kind of adjacent to those sectors back to work. There are, 3 million abandoned wells in the country, and that work can be done for comparable wages and benefits, sort of filling those wells, putting people on payrolls. These are demands which are coming from extractive states. There's a organization of 31 state governments, which has demanded that the federal government, through the Department of Energy, take action to keep workers on their payrolls to plug abandoned wells. This is all, this isn't crazy aspirational stuff. I think if we want to get to a next level of action, we could talk about a federal job guarantee to provide sort of a backstop for people who, want livelihoods, want a sort of on-ramp into future work. But a lot of this stuff is just out there. Things like, weatherization programs through the USDA. I could go on, but there are very obvious policies which Democrats could be advocating for right now that they're just not.
Right, and this is the time for crazy aspirational proposals, right? I mean, this is what the original New Deal grew out of, a moment of crisis and mass unemployment, a productive economy, and a banking system that had ground to a halt. I also, one of the things in your piece that really stood out for me, Dean, was, you stressed with things like reforming patent and intellectual property, that you are working to level out inequalities in the pre-tax economy. So much of the political debate around the economy in America is about tax cuts, and it's in many, as we've been saying tonight, a kind of grievously irrelevant topic at this moment, but it's also the body of proposals you put forward, which are both, I would say, aspirational and realistic, kind of nicely sidestep this issue that has dominated economic politics for, all of my political life, basically.
Yeah, I think the focus on taxes, it's easy because it's easy in the sense that we could see them. They're right in front of our face. But I think it misses to a large extent what's actually going on. One of the points I make is that the increase in inequality over the last 4 decades has been overwhelmingly pre-tax. This isn't original with me. I mean, that's a lot. There's a lot of data on that.
Right.
And the tax rates actually have fallen some. They've fallen a lot. I'm not opposed to seeing higher tax rates on rich people, but the reality is they haven't fallen quite as much as is often claimed. So we could look at the top marginal tax rate. It was 90% till the early 60s. It was 70% till Reagan took office. And now it's 37%. But the reality is that you also have a 3.5%, I'm forgetting the exact number, roughly 3.5% Medicare tax that's new, wasn't there in the early 60s. And then some of the states, California being the highest, they have a 13% marginal tax rate. Again, none of this is to apologize, rich people are being hit by this or anything, but the point is that if you're a rich person living in California, which has a lot of the richest people in the country, you're paying a marginal tax rate of over 50%. So you've seen it's lower than it was, but it's not quite as much as is often portrayed. And again, the rise in inequality is on the before tax side. So what I'm interested in is trying to change rules on patents and copyrights so there's not as much money going to people like Bill Gates, rules in the financial sector, because you have people making out like bandits there who, again, aren't contributing to the productive economy. If you could tell me a story, okay, you've steered money to all these great startups and they have all these great innovations in climate and other areas, fine. You can't show that. I mean, the people who make big money, well, half the time it's insider trading, but in any case, very hard pressed to make the case that they've made great contributions to the economy. Another one, CEOs. Again, you could tell the story that here's this great CEO who did, I'm just talking about making money for the corporation. I'm not even talking about for society as a whole. You could occasionally tell this story. They turned around a company. That's not the vast majority of CEOs. And when you have CEOs, even where they're astoundingly bad, again, from the standpoint of the shareholders, not I don't like them. Think of John Stumpf, who was the CEO at Wells Fargo when they're in the middle of this fake account scandal. He walked away with over $100 million. Did he do a great job by the shareholders? Maybe if he wouldn't have gotten caught, he would have, but he did. But why does this guy get $100 million? I mean, I'm just mentioning those as extreme cases. But if you go back to the 60s, the 70s, CEOs were well paid. They got paid 20, 30 times the pay of ordinary workers. So that would get you $2 million, $3 million a year. Now they're getting 250, 300 times the pay of ordinary workers,
right.
15, 20 million a year. That's corporate governance. We have a corporate governance structure that makes it very, very difficult for shareholders to rein in CEOs. And this isn't a secret. I mean, you could read this in the business press. I mean, the idea that, oh, I'm a big shareholder and I don't like it that this jerk is the CEO and he's walking away with 15, 20 million a year. It's really hard to change that. The boards that determine CEO pay are overwhelmingly owe their positions to CEO and top management. They have no incentive. And I've raised this sometimes. I go, oh, not that I'm that often in touch with board members, but I have occasion. I go, well, do they ever have a discussion like maybe we could get someone just as good for half the price? Invariably, they laugh.
Right.
But I go, isn't that what you're supposed to do? Isn't you're supposed to be representing shareholders?
Your obligation to your shareholders, right?
Yeah. So aren't you supposed to be saying, well, we're paying this person $15 million a year. Are they worth it? Can we get someone just as good for $5 million? But they don't do that because they have no incentive to do that. They never get directors that are supported for reelection by their board win reelection over 99% of the time. So if you want to stay on your board, the best way to do it isn't to reach out to your shareholders and go, oh, we have these jerks in top management. The best way is to stay on good terms with the other board members. And that's what they do. But that's all the structure of management. There's nothing in other countries in Europe. It's easier for shareholders to control management. The best example is, of course, Germany, where you have co-determination. Half the board, it's not quite half, I think it's one less than half, is workers' representatives.
Right.
And their CEOs are paid much, much less. They're still well paid. I don't have a problem with that. But we'd be in a very different world if the CEOs of our largest companies were getting 2 to 3 million rather than 20 million.
Yes, and I am duty bound to observe that O.C. Denwanevu, another of TNR staff writers, has a very good piece live on our site this week making the case for worker participation and, in fact, worker ownership of corporate bodies. This, again, it sounds in the American context like a crazy aspirational proposal. It was something that Bernie Sanders ran on and was a really novel part of his, agenda. But as you note, it's a very common practice in many European countries. And I think, your comments also bring to mind, this huge problem I think we're already witnessing in the early phase of this crisis of monopoly players exerting greater and greater influence. Jeff Bezos is now poised to become the first trillionaire potentially in history, and the main economic players that are making out in this crisis, not surprisingly, are people like him, people like Mark Zuckerberg. And I think, there's a real problem going forward, especially when we're looking at a practical situation where a lot of small businesses like restaurants can only open to 25 or 50% capacity. So what are the concrete measures in terms of antitrust and in making, the economy truly competitive for small business that you see having to take shape?
Well, the antitrust department of the Justice Department's largely been on vacation for 4 decades. This has been both a Democratic and Republican story. Republicans have been worse, in fairness to Democrats. But they've allowed a lot of things to go through that, at least in retrospect, and at the time I would say this as well, almost unconscionable. So Facebook, Google, they've been buying up potential competitors all over the place, and Uber now wants to buy up, was it Grub Eats or whatever? So Uber is a delivery service. They want to buy up their major competitor. I mean, how could you let that go through? I mean, these are companies each have like 30%. I'd have to look at the exact number, but each have like 30% of the market. So you combine them, they'd be around 70. So how is that not an antitrust violation? Instagram was bought up by Facebook. And at the time, this was in the business press, the reason for buying it up was they were a potential competitor. And this is like textbook violation of antitrust. So they've taken a big vacation over the last 4 decades, but a lot of it even goes beyond that. So in the case of Amazon's growth, it's less of an issue for Amazon today than it was 10 years ago, but even now it's still an issue. They weren't paying sales tax. Right. And I mean, there was literally no argument. I'd be in rooms with other economists. I go, what's the argument? Because, I could see people having different views, but why on earth would Amazon not pay sales tax? So if I go to my corner grocery store, corner bookstore, I'm going to pay sales tax. I get it from Amazon, already a huge company a decade ago. I don't pay sales tax. Why would you do that? Why would you structure your economy that way? I say it's still an issue today. They boast about it. I wrote something once and they jumped on the editor saying, oh, we pay sales tax. Well, I was careful. I was talking about past tense, but they do pay sales tax on their own sales. But all the what do they call them, affiliates? Right. So if I'm an affiliate and I'm selling through Amazon, that's only around 40%. It's a very large share of their sales and they get a cut on it. It's up to the affiliate. Amazon doesn't take responsibility. Well, that shouldn't be a tough one. If you're making money on it, you're responsible to see that the sales tax gets collected. That's not hard. So again, this is beyond antitrust. There's just zero justification. Well, I'm saying beyond antitrust because antitrust, I'll confess, I'm not an expert on antitrust law. So I understand many of these things will be arguable points, but that's not an arguable point. There's no reason to subsidize one of the largest companies in the world by saying you don't have to collect sales tax. Facebook, which I mentioned a moment ago, again, antitrust issues there. But one of the huge issues is they're not subject to the same liability laws as other media companies. So if you guys, the New Republic, if you print an ad, not even your own work, so you print an ad, someone prints an ad saying something about Joe Biden or Donald Trump that's not true, they can not only sue whoever put the ad in, they'll sue you guys. You're responsible. Well, not Facebook. And why is that? Mark Zuckerberg says he doesn't want to be responsible for determining what's true. Well, maybe you guys don't, but you have to. As does Time Warner and all the other big traditional media companies. Again, I'm not necessarily going to cry for them, but the point is there's zero reason to give Facebook some special privilege that the other major media companies don't have. And needless to say, it would be a very different world. Suppose Facebook were responsible, not just for the ads, but for everything people post. Again, just to be clear here, I'm not expecting that they go around on everyone's Facebook page. But the point you could do is you could say, okay, Joe, whoever, put something that was totally untrue about me on their Facebook page. It got circulated 5 million times. I want Facebook to be liable for that. And they know how to do that. They have the technology. They could check this. And if I could show, look, what they said about me was not true, they could go back and put a correction on every one of those 5 million Facebook pages. What they said about Dean Baker wasn't true. Why shouldn't they be liable for that?
All good questions. And this has actually been a really engaging and fruitful discussion of, that I want to see take much broader root in our political debate, especially in the pending election year. So I did neglect to say at the outset that we are taking questions, and we have about 10 minutes set aside to do so. So we're going to pivot to questions from the audience now. The first I have here is from Joseph Sadel, who has a question for you, Dean, asking, taking off of what you were saying about recent change in Fed policy, acknowledging the importance of income distribution. Joe is asking, hasn't Fed policy actually widened the gaps in wealth? And why in general are you, Dean, less worried about wealth inequality if wealth rather than income is a key source of political power?
Well, a couple things. First off, I think up till the pandemic, I think they were certainly leading to more equal income distribution, in the sense that by allowing us to get to 3.5% unemployment, that led to much more equal distribution. In terms of why I see income as being more important than wealth, I think wealth is actually a very poor measure. I could go into a lot of detail on this, but I'll just give a couple points. One is, it's almost definitional. When interest rates fall, wealth rises. Just to take the simplest case, I have a bond that pays me a $10 payout every year. What's that bond worth? Well, if the interest rate is half as high, that bond, the value of that bond is twice as much. That doesn't bother me. That doesn't trouble me that, oh my God, there's more wealth because of that. That really doesn't trouble me. Another issue with income, wealth, how we measure these things. With wealth, if I have a 401k, that counts in my measure of wealth. So my retirement's a 401k, it actually is. That will count as wealth. But suppose I have a traditional pension, it's going to pay me $30,000, $40,000 a year in retirement. That doesn't count as wealth. So I think our measures of wealth are actually fairly complicated, and they don't give us as simple a story as we might like in terms of where people stand. And what I'm inclined to say is, if you knock down income, wealth will follow. So if we're bothered, and I am, by Jeff Bezos's huge wealth and Bill Gates' huge wealth, if we knock down their income, knock down the money they're getting from Amazon, from Microsoft, their wealth will follow. So I focus on income. I really think that's the primary factor here.
Okay. I have another question here from Gabriel Agostini, asking about the United States Postal Service, which is now facing a lot of hostility from the right, and perhaps at least loose talk about shutting it down. Gabe is also asking if the Postal Service survives, would this be a good moment, speaking of the ill effects of financialization, to revive something like the old idea of the U.S. Postal Bank? And if so, what would be the strengths or weaknesses of such a plan? Kate, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I love the idea of postal banking. I'm not an expert on it by any means, but I think, the fact that most Americans don't have access, not most, but there are far too many people without access to basic banking services. And we have, these institutions, these public institutions that exist in every community around the country, which are very well set up to do that. There is an interesting proposal, sort of getting a bit back to the Green New Deal conversation, from the Postal Workers Union in Canada, to sort of house more services actually within the within post offices. And so including postal banking, but also being a place for things like CSA pickup, supporting local agriculture, being, having solar panels on their roofs, being a real kind of hub for communities that just don't exist right now. I mean, we don't have, a number of social institutions. So yeah, just briefly would say, if we're investing in infrastructure, as a part of the recovery, I think it's worth, considering what all counts as infrastructure, and certainly banking services are, I would argue, kind of crucial social infrastructure, as is, a lot of other public institutions that are not sort of counted traditionally, and
Right.
along with bridges and roads.
I just say quickly with the post office, it's important to understand this is 600,000 plus middle class jobs, and these are jobs with healthcare, with pensions. And that's part of the reason the rights hated the post. They hate this because the idea is, oh, these guys are just delivering the mail. That's unskilled. Why should they be able to have a home and put their kids through college and have a decent pension? I've seen these people. It really, the idea drives them nuts. And of course, on top of that, we have Trump with his thing that Jeff Bezos, of course, owns the Washington Post, and he's convinced he's made out like a bandit on, his deal. It is probably a good deal, but nowhere near as good as he makes it out to be, his deal with the post office. So that's another element to this.
Yes, no, and it is striking, to think it's sort of an object case study in something that was once a universal public good that did support a middle class, now being demonized because, it's associated with the government and the public sector, which sort of segues into the next question we have here from Jesse Hicks, asking, I feel like, this is him speaking, I feel like I know the answer, but I'd like to hear more about why Democrats don't seem to push for more of these programs. Everything that we've talked about tonight is broadly popular. Is it something you attribute to fecklessness or, let's say, incuriousness, if that's a word, about the deeper structural issues at play here? It's a very good question, and one that I often think about. So whoever wants.
I think I'll try and be quick. I think it's a combination of, on the one hand, they answer to a lot of the same people that the Republicans do. The financial industry has a lot of influence in the Democratic Party, and that it's not really like I have to go digging. I mean, who was their main econ person for a decade or more? Robert Rubin, who was at Goldman Sachs, and then when he left to Citigroup. So the idea that he would, again, I don't even have to attach any pernicious. If you came from the AFL-CIO, it wouldn't be, like a wild thing to say. You have the interest of labor at heart. It'd be odd if you didn't. Well,
Right.
He has the interest of the financial industry at heart. That's the way he sees the world. So part of it is very directly answering to them. Inertia is an enormous force. I mean, I came to realize that in Washington, that when you're talking to these people, they go, "Oh, okay, that's great. That's a great idea, Baker. But why do I have to do that? What is that going to get me reelected? Is that going to prevent me from having a strong opponent?" So they're not there. They're not political philosophers. I have a blog, Beat the Press, and I always jump on the media when they say, "Oh, so-and-so believes, so-and-so is concerned." No, you don't know what they believe. You don't know what they concern. These people are politicians. They want to know what's going to get me reelected, what's going to get me in trouble. So Kate and I could come there with all our great ideas, and they might even agree with us, but they want to know, okay, do I risk getting in trouble if I do that? And odds are they do. So they're going to do what's the course of least resistance.
Yes, I am also in Washington, and I have to, agree with the brunt of your analysis there. Kate, do you have any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would broadly agree. I mean, the thing that stood out to me as someone who I think is predisposed to arguments to say, these establishment Democrats are just neoliberals, they're, really just pursuing this particular ideological agenda. And I think more often than not, it just comes down to defending turf and defending, staff jobs or, elected positions. And it's often just, does not seem more complicated than that.
And I do think one of the valuable contributions of classical economics to these kind of conversations is to just, openly acknowledge these are the incentives. People are, advancing their careers, and they need to think about the next election cycle. I do think at the same time, I think we're in a moment where perhaps the greater risk is not thinking more boldly. That right now the status quo arrangements do not look like the safest path through this moment.
We have to convince the politicians that it's safer for them. They want to get reelected, not to put down them as, you know, they're concerned about the country, but first and foremost, they want to know what will get them reelected. So we have to convince them the safest way for them to get reelected is say, I'm in favor of big green jobs program.
Right.
That's what we have to do.
All right. Well, we have our mission before us. So
It's a good place to end.
yes, good. Many thanks. It's been a really engaging conversation, and I look forward to hearing more from you in your day jobs. So
Thanks a lot for arranging this.
again.
Yeah, thank you.